Okay, I'm going to try to be super loud so that everybody in the hall knows that the beer talk is starting. So the beer talk is starting in the Hall of Heroes. This is what everybody came here for. I know I did. I'm going to introduce Dave Cousino. Dave Cousino is a brewmaster. He actually won a contest. I'll probably get it all wrong, but go with it. He made a Saison for the Sam Adams long shot competition, which is held in Colorado. How many applicants?
A few hundred.
Thousands and thousands, or a few hundred applicants. And his beer was finished in the top three.
Yeah, they picked a total of 3.
They picked 3 winners. Dave's beer was one of those beers. So he is a brewmaster, and we're happy to have him here. He's going to talk about the science of beer. Thanks.
Welcome,
All right, thanks, Chad. First of all, I'll say when Chad asked me to give this talk, I immediately said yes. I wanted to jump at it, basically because I love beer. I love drinking beer, I love brewing beer, and I love talking about beer. As evidenced, when I go out to a bar with my friends and we order something, they're like, roll their eyes, Dave, do we have to talk about the beer? Can we just enjoy it? Do we have to analyze it, break it down, give it a score, rate it on Untapped? I said, yes, we do. We have to do all of those things because that's how I grow as a brewer. That's how I learn things. It's how I incorporate new things into my process. Now, I've given talks to my local homebrew club back in Cleveland, but that's to a group of brewers, home brewers, who are already immersed in the subject. So when I was putting this together, I thought, what am I going to tell a group of pharmacists who may not know what I'm talking about? And when I got to thinking about the basic skill set that pharmacists have that we learn in our early curriculum and what brewers use as they're brewing beer, there's a lot of overlap in the core knowledge we have in biology, chemistry, biochemistry, microbiology, thermodynamics, physics. Well, my physics is a little shaky at this point, but they're all subjects that both pharmacists and brewers have. So if you've ever taken a tour at a brewery, they usually step you through the process. I'm going to kind of do the same thing, but maybe give you a little more context and things that you already understand. So the first thing they'll show you in a brewery is the mash tun. That's where they take the grains, put it in a giant stainless steel vessel, put it with hot water, with the purpose of extracting the sugars out of those grains and getting that wort. W-O-R-T is the word, wort, that we use to describe basically sugar water. It's basically beer before it's beer. Malt is, any grain can be malted. For beer, we're talking about barley, malted barley, but any grain can be malted. And what that is the grain is wetted, kept warm, spread out flat, and allowed to sprout. Now, the grain will send up a little acrospire as it's starting to grow, little rootlets sprout, and the endosperm is developing all the enzymes that we're going to hijack to make beer for us. That product is dried, tumbled to remove the acrospire and the little rootlets, and then it's kilned, and depending on the heat and the duration that it's kilned at will determine the darkness of the grain or the malt and ultimately the color of the beer, how dark or light it is. Now, we take that malt, crack it, and put it with hot water and set it at a specific temperature that we determine based on the type of beer we want. The enzymes that have developed, there's proteases, proteinases, dextrinases, but the main one we're concerned about hijacking for our purposes are the amylases. There's the alpha amylase is the enzyme that primarily works in a temperature range of 140 to 158 degrees Fahrenheit. The beta amylases work best at 139 to 149 degrees Fahrenheit, a little bit lower. The alpha amylases will take these hundreds to thousands of glucose unit chains and break them down, but they can only break it in the middle. So they take gigantic molecules and make less gigantic molecules out of it. While the beta amylases they nip those polyglucose molecules at the end in 1, 2, and 3 units, and those are all fermentable by the yeast. So I mentioned the temperature ranges because we can pick a temperature range. If we pick it a little higher where the alpha amylases are working best, the wort and the end beer is going to be a little, or the end product is a little less fermentable. So if the beer is going to be have a little more body, it's going to be perceived as sweet on the tongue, so it's going to be a big, heavy beer with a little residual sweetness. If we're targeting a lower mash temperature, it's going to give us a little more fermentable wort with simpler sugars that are easy to ferment. The end beer is going to be a little drier, maybe a little more alcohol content to it. So that's how we can think about it as we're tailoring the beers we're trying to make. So at the end of the mash, we're going to do that for about 60 to 90 minutes to convert all the sugars. Then we separate that sweet wort into the boil kettle, and we rinse the grains with hot water. Just a quick note about water. I don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but the water profile, you have to understand your local water profile and try to match it to the water profile of the region where the beer you're trying to brew is famous for. If you're brewing a Dunkel, you have to look to that area of Germany and try to mimic their water profile. You're looking at the permanent hardness, the temporary hardness, and the specific ions, trying to match that. We could talk for a day about that, but it's very important. If you have a good beer recipe, you can make a good beer recipe great if you really tweak your water profile. So we take that, we rinse the grains of all that sugar, and we're into the boil kettle, and we add heat, and we bring it to a boil. And the boil serves several purposes for us. It sanitizes the wort. It kills any wild bacteria or wild yeast that may have taken up residence during the earlier process. It also, there's a lot of chemical reactions going on in the wort. The sugars are being caramelized. There's a lot of Maillard reactions going on between the amino acids and the sugars. There's proteins are coagulating and dropping out a solution that we don't want in there. And this is the point where we add the hops. The Humulus lupulus plant is, there are hundreds of hop varieties, and it's really the soul of the beer, in my opinion. I like hops. Many varieties that have many different bittering and flavoring and aromatic properties. So we're going to pick the hops that we're going to add to the style of beer that we want to make. There are over 500 aromatic and organic compounds in yeast that have been, or I'm sorry, in hops that have been isolated. Two of the most prominent ones that we're interested in are the humulones, which are a group of alpha acids that we're going to isomerize and get into solution, and the lupulones are a group of beta acids. Those are, if you pick up a package of yeast, they're always rated by the percentage of those acid contents. The alpha acids lend themselves to the bitterness of the beer. The problem is they're not soluble at all. They require boiling to be isomerized. And as pharmacists, we know that an isomer is the same chemical structure, just a different physical orientation. It requires boiling to do that, and that gets those acids into solution. The beta acids are also not very soluble, and they have to be isomerized to come into solution, but they mostly contribute to the flavor of the beer, not so much the bitterness. Tons and tons of other organic compounds in the hops, a few of which are very antiseptic. If I like to tell the story about the IPAs, the India Pale Ales, a very hoppy, big beer. When England would send supplies to their colonies in India, the beer wouldn't make the trip. It would end up spoiled. And in a time before anybody knew anything about antiseptics and bacteria or even yeast, they found out if they really packed these beers with a lot of hops, they would be preserved and they would make the trip. And so it's kind of amazing. Beer really drove the understanding of bacteria and antiseptics in that way. So now we're at the end of the boil and we have the hops in there, and we have to run that into the fermenter, and we want to chill it as quickly as possible. We don't want any bacteria getting in there, and there are a lot of chemical reactions that are taking place while the beer is cooling and off flavors are developing. We got to get it chilled fast. So brewers will use a giant heat exchanger, and as a home brewer I use a similar tool. It's a reverse flow counterflow wort chiller. It's basically a large lumen that we run cold water one way, a smaller lumen inside of that, and we run the hot beer the other way. And we use a stainless steel or copper, a highly conductive metal, and you can chill a half barrel of beer in about 15 minutes from boiling to 65 degrees very rapidly. So now we've got everything, we've got it chilled, we're down on the fermenter. We take a specific gravity reading that'll tell us the dissolved solids that are in there, and we're measuring sugar content. Distilled water has a specific gravity of 1.0. Alcohol has a specific gravity of 0.79. So as it ferments and alcohol is increasing and sugar is decreasing, the specific gravity will drop. So we take a reading at the beginning of fermentation and the end, and we can calculate the alcohol content. For home brewers, it's just a gee whiz, this is how strong my beer is. But for commercial brewers, the government looks at that for their tax rate. They take that very seriously. After we have it chilled, we've taken the gravity reading, we have to inoculate that beer with a yeast that's going to ferment it. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the yeast. It's brewer's yeast. There are many, many strains. We talk about a clean fermenting yeast is a yeast that basically just ferments into alcohol and carbon dioxide. There are other strains that kick off a lot of esters and ketones and organic and volatile compounds that lend themselves to those particular styles of beer, and we'll choose one depending on how clean or how we want that beer to taste. Now, as pharmacists, we're trying to kill yeast every time we come across it. But brewers, we try to foster the best environment for the yeast. That's not to say we don't want to stress the yeast, because if we take a yeast and give them a condition maybe outside of their comfort zone, they might start fermenting a little more aggressively, throwing off a little better flavor profile for us. So if a yeast likes to have X amount of cells per liter, we might pitch less or inoculate with less, and we might give it a little higher temperature range than it normally likes, and we can really accentuate the characteristics of that yeast. So after fermentation is done, we might consider adding a secondary yeast. Brettanomyces is a strain of yeast that really lives in wood, and if you have a lot of wood barrel aged beers, can give it a kind of a different flavor. We also can use as a secondary fermenter some bacteria. Lactobacillus is a favorite to really sour a beer. If you've ever had a Gosa, it's probably fermented with lactobacillus. And literally, you take a container of Greek yogurt and add it to the fermenter, and that will sour that beer. Drop the pH to 3 to 4. You can use probiotic tablets you buy. They're a little expensive. It's, in my opinion, it's cheaper to use the Greek yogurt. So after fermentation, we cold crash the beer. It means bring it down to fridge temperatures, let all the yeast go dormant and fall out of solution. Proteins coagulate, fall out of solution, clears the beer. We transfer that. I keg my beer. It's just, rather than clean a bunch of bottles, I just clean a keg, transfer it over, force carbonate it. About a week, it's ready to go. Unless you're lagering it and you want it to clean up a little bit, that's another story. So I'm going to leave you with this, and this is something you can use. I don't know how many keg parties you guys are going to lately, but if you do, let's say it's a keg, you got it on ice, jockey box, beer flowing through the coils in the jockey box. It's coming out, it's super foamy. People are panicked, you don't know what to do. What's happening is that keg is not on a traditional draft setup. it's going through a much longer coil in that jockey box, much bigger volume. The carbon dioxide is coming out of solution on its way to the tap, and it gets there, it's foam, and it's shooting out. Well, somebody wants, it's gushing, we got to turn the pressure down. Brew, I want you to listen to me and be the hero. You get it? He gets it. Turn the pressure up. 22, 25 psi, run a couple pints through, and that beer will settle down, and you will be the hero, and you'll be a legend. So that's all I got. Thank you, everybody.